Here we go. Hi, my name is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I am the Director for Center in Modern Turkish Studies at Carleton University, MTS. And this is Talking Turkey, our webinar series in which we talk with experts, journalists, academics, policymakers on Turkey and about Turkey, anything from foreign policy to culture to domestic politics. This is the second episode of Talking Turkey series, and I'm very pleased to have Dr. Chris Kilford here as our guest today. Dr. Kilford is a member of the National Board of Canadian International Council, CIC, and the president of the CIC's Victoria branch. He also a PhD in history from Queen's University with a focus on civil-military relations in the developing world. Today, Chris is a fellow at the Queen's Center for International and Defense Policy and a sessional professor with the Canadian Forces College, where he teaches online courses focused on geopolitical issues. Prior to this academic career, Chris enjoyed a 36 years career in the Canadian Armed Forces. In July 2009, he deployed to Kabul, Afghanistan as a deputy military attaché until July of next year, and then commenced a series of training with regards to Turkish before heading to Ankara as the Canadian Defense Attaché with a cross accreditation to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan from July 11th to July 2014. He retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in September 2014. Since retiring from the military, Chris has become a recognized expert on Turkish foreign policy and Middle Eastern political issues. He wrote book chapters, articles, and opinion pieces on Canadian defense and foreign policy issues, plus Turkish and Middle Eastern matters. Have appeared in numerous Canadian and international publications. And in addition, he has spoken internationally on Turkish and Middle Eastern foreign policy issues on many occasions and conducted numerous television and radio interviews on covering similar subjects. He was also part of the workshop that we did last year in March with the Defense and Security Foresight Group that looks at Turkey and NATO relations in 2025, and his contributions to that workshop was very valuable in drafting the final paper. So it's a pleasure to have you back here again, Chris. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Balkan, and hello, everybody. And this is, it's always fun to talk about Turkey. And just to get set up to talk about Turkey, I have my plaque that I was very proud to receive from the Turkish Armed Forces when I left in 2014, just behind me. I had a chance to go back to Turkey in 2015 and 2017. And then just recently, well, not recently now, I suppose, but November 2019 for a few weeks. And, here today, the focus is on Canada-Turkey relations, and we'll also likely get into some other subjects as well. And I'll just start off by giving an overview of Canada-Turkey relations. It's something I've written about before and have a book chapter coming out soon also on this subject. And, at first glance, quite often there's not a lot to really say. Canada and Turkey are, I would say, good friends, allies. We're members of NATO, members of the United Nations, of course, the G20, and we've had diplomatic relations since 1940s. And I would characterize relations as good, but sometimes we have friction points, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. In terms of the trading relationship, though, $3.6 billion both ways. It has gone up over time. I'm sure because of COVID, it will have dropped off. And in terms of, just out of interest, foreign direct investment, Canada has about, in 2019, $1.3 billion in foreign direct investment in Turkey, but really nothing that comes the other way. And when we do talk about relations between countries, we do focus on trade, and that's why I've brought it up right from the start. And there have been discussions between Canada and Turkey for quite some time about establishing a free trade agreement, but we just haven't been able to get there, although we have signed a joint economic and trade agreement in 2019 with a view to improving matters down the road. And I was quite surprised the other day to be in my local pharmacy in Victoria, where I live, and I saw glass vases from Pasha on sale, which was quite something to see. Now, in terms of the relations, if you go onto the Canadian website and you look at what it has to say about Turkey, it does paint actually a very optimistic picture. But when you look at the travel advisory website that the government has for Turkey, it then paints a slightly different picture. And it advises Canadians, to be careful in Turkey because of things that we have seen in the southeast, the terrorist threat that does come up from time to time. But also it warns Canadians to be very careful about what they may put on social media about Turkey. Because of what we see with people often getting in trouble if they write something that's negative about the government or criticize the president, for example. So we have a tale of two cities, if you like, when it comes to what we see on our government websites when it concerns Turkey. I mentioned some frictions because the relationship is good, but there are frictions. And you can go back to 2004 when the Canadian government recognized the Armenian genocide. That has caused not big problems, but it does come up. But what has happened since 2004 is that we see more governments and more levels of governments in various countries recognizing the genocide. So we don't stand out as much as we used to. And so it has, I think, had less and less of an impact today as it compared to what it had before. But nevertheless, we have seen most recently Canada put an arms embargo on Turkey. It's not the first time. After 1974 in Cyprus, Canada did the same thing. But more recently, because of Operation Peace Spring, where we saw the Turkish military enter into northern Syria, Canada did place an arms embargo on Turkey. And in April, we extended that embargo indefinitely. Now, there are a number of caveats to lessen the impact. I mean, we are NATO partners, and if it is all about NATO issues and requirements, then some armaments would still flow. And Turkey is Canada's fourth highest purchaser of our defense equipment internationally. So it's not a big amount. In 2018, it was about $116 million, but that's still significant when it comes to our international arms sales. So to put an embargo on Turkey, it has some impact. Now, more recently, though, with the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, we saw this arms embargo extended to include engines for Turkey's drones and also the camera system as well, the Westcam system. It really upset the Turkish government. And even just a few days ago, President Erdogan in a speech called us, Canada, not outright, but called us a bad neighbor for what we did, and said that NATO countries shouldn't put embargoes on other NATO countries. But there's more to the story there. And regardless, we have an embargo on those pieces of the one of the Turkish drone systems that was actually used very successfully in Nagorno-Karabakh in the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now, sorry.
On that issue, if I may just jump in for
yeah.
I think this is actually, I think interesting way of trying to sort of balance the domestic pressures from different lobbying groups here in Canada versus relations with allies. From what I read, and I might be wrong here, so please do correct me if that's wrong, but what was sort of stopped was further export permits on those components for drones, particularly the camera component, which is crucial for target acquisition and identification and so on and so forth. So, but that does not necessarily cover the previously issued permits that from what I read, did actually go beyond some point in 2021. I don't exactly remember the date. So the idea was like no more permits will be issued, but that doesn't necessarily stop the agreements that was already done and will be shipped out through last year and this year, sort of thing. I might be wrong on the details.
No, you're right, and those are the caveats. If you look at the embargo that we have in place, there are all kinds of caveats. You might say that it's somewhat symbolic, that it's sending a message that we're not happy, and that has, I mean, obviously it is a message, and I would have to actually go and look and see how the sales or how where do those Westcam targeting pods that are so important, as you mentioned, where does the actual cutoff take place? And of course, now the fighting has come to a stop. So what do you do now? I mean, I looked to see what the government was saying about this, but there wasn't anything new on this. But so now, if we do reflect on it, you would have to say that it was a message, and it's clear the Canadian Armenian community and Project Plowshares were raising this issue of why Canadian equipment was on these drones that were being used to, in this case, kill Armenian soldiers and Nagorno-Karabakh troops as that fighting progressed. And it was a bit counterproductive for the Azeris to have all of the videos of their of these drones in action. It was counterproductive because it basically tipped off the international community to what was happening and how effective these drones actually were. And for their purposes, of course, they were using it as a tool to show how successful they were being, but it was counterproductive in the international community, because we even saw in the UK a manufacturer of fuel pumps for some of Turkey's drones saying, hey, we're not going to be providing you any more of this technology either, because of what we were seeing.
I think that's an important point, and of course, like I said, there's a lot of sort of the typical lobbying components going on. I guess Israeli drones and the support for the Azeri forces were also very important. For example, in that particular fight, but because they were mostly domestically produced with the indigenous, in essence, technology, they did not necessarily face the same problem in shifting and selling them, I guess, right? So, but yeah, so I think there's a lot sort of the governments need to sort of figure out how to balance alliance relationships and where to send the symbolic messages, and while how to try to deal with the ethnic lobbies at home on the one hand. So I find that sort of policies of embargoes and freezing export licenses and so on and so forth, an interesting case to analyze both symbolic action as well as real meaningful action. So that's I think an interesting
Yeah.
point.
It does raise the issue, why do you put an embargo on Turkey and not Saudi Arabia? We've been through that debate in the media. Because of the light armored vehicle contract we have, which is a big contract. And so once you start placing arms embargoes on countries for certain reasons, then you set a pattern and you have to, arguably stick with it. And even more sensitive, of course, when you're putting an embargo on a NATO ally.
Indeed. So sorry for interrupting there.
Yeah. Well, no, and I have another friction point, which is also very important, and it all comes about as a result of the attempted coup in Turkey in 2016, and as the government of Turkey notes, and I think more and more scholars are, although there's always an argument about who was behind the coup, but the fingers tend to point at the Gulen movement, and as a result, if you were a member of that movement, you suddenly found yourself, if you were in Turkey, you found yourself being arrested, being detained, losing your job and all that, or fleeing. You had to flee the country. Or if you were outside of the country and either a Gulenist or somebody was pointing a finger at you, you didn't go home. And what we saw in Canada after the coup between 2017 and 2019, we had about 4,600 Turks granted political asylum here in Canada. Now, that was the highest number of any country. So you know, again, this is a NATO ally, it's a friend, and yet you're granting 4,600 people political asylum. And this has continued even through 2020. We don't have all the statistics on the web available to us because of COVID, but up until about July of last year, there were 400 more Turkish citizens granted asylum. And there are another 1,715 files that are in the hopper being looked at right now. So are all these folks members of the Gulen movement? Arguably not, but probably quite a few are. I know through my own contacts here in Canada that there is an extensive, Gulen network and members, and many of them are here because they have claimed asylum. But for the Turkish government, of course, who regard the Gulen movement as a terrorist organization, they then look at their NATO ally and say, well, you're giving political asylum to terrorists. And that's not what allies do. And that is a friction point that we have. And that is something that the Turkish ambassador has raised publicly before. So these are some of the friction points. Where are some of the good things? Well, we get along, that's for sure. A lot of Canadian tourists go to Turkey, but it did drop off once the Islamic State terrorist attacks occurred in sort of 2015, 2016. But nevertheless, Canadians do go to Turkey. We do have a good relationship that way. And we have something that I call monument diplomacy between the two countries. And that started in 2012 when the monument to fallen diplomats in Ottawa was unveiled by Ahmet Davutoglu, the foreign minister at the time. And, it's a monument that was created in Turkey. It's in Ottawa. It's very close to where the Turkish defense attaché was assassinated in 1982. So we have that as a symbol of connection between the two countries. And then what we have going the other way is the Royal Newfoundland Regiment fought at Gallipoli in 1915. And I worked on this file, my predecessors worked on this file, but it looks like we're very close to having a big caribou monument at Gallipoli, perhaps later this year. It's part of the trail of the caribou that follows the Royal Newfoundland Regiment through the various battles at Gallipoli and then into Europe. And it hasn't been easy to get this done. But it looks like it's going to happen. And that's why I call it monument diplomacy. It's what's connecting the two countries, that and the fact that we have a couple of Canadians who play on the Beşiktaş football club in Istanbul. But overall, I would say relations are good. And we can just move over, if you like, to the situation in Iraq.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
We have another issue.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating with the monument diplomacy. I think because I know the Altkat assassination and a monument here in Ottawa, and CTC, Council of Turkish Canadians, regularly every year have a commemoration on the date there. But I didn't know about the Newfoundland regiment. Of course, the sort of with the battles in Gallipoli, Anzacs, and sort of Australian and New Zealand presence there has a lot of coverage, and I think this also plays a significant role in sort of the national identity formation for both Australians and New Zealanders in terms of coming to terms who they are. So that has always been an important part also within Turkish education history. So Turkish school children would know about the Anzacs and sort of how the relations developed there and the presence of those monuments. But I didn't know about the Canadian.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's really important. Actually, my grandfather fought at Gallipoli in 1915 and landed at Suvla Bay with the British Middlesex Regiment. That's why I was always proud to go to Gallipoli, and actually took my dad there as well in 2012. but the Newfoundland Regiment was there. We had about 60 Canadians actually killed at Gallipoli who were members of the, they were in Australia and New Zealand and Great Britain at the time of the war, and they were Canadian, but they joined those particular militaries and ended up there. Plus we had 2 Canadian field hospitals on Lemnos Island as well. So, but it's important to remember, of course, that Newfoundland was not part of Canada at that particular time. But for the Newfoundland Regiment, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment now, of course, it is an incredibly important part of their history. And, it's so exciting now that we're having this take place, and that it'll be a draw for the future for Canadians to go to Gallipoli in even more numbers than they do now.
That's I think quite an interesting tidbit that I don't think many people would know. So I think that's great to have it. But so like you said, maybe let's try to look at it more broadly on the regional issues. You spend a lot of time in and have on the ground experience both in Afghanistan, in Turkey as the military attaché, and you have been following what has been going on in the Middle East. If you look at Turkish foreign policy, or sort of the evolution of it in the past 10 years, where was it, particularly when it comes to the issues in the Middle East? Where was it and where is it now? How would you sort of describe that evolution since, say, 2009, when you were stationed in Afghanistan, and then up until maybe today?
Yeah, great question. And very often difficult to know where to start, because I do a lot of talks on Turkey, probably 60 or so in the last couple of years, and I've got one coming up soon. But where do you start? Well, I think if you go into that sort of, let's start with the Arab Spring. I like the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, of course, swept across many of the countries in the region. And as things started to go a little bit sideways, I recall how much in the international media, et cetera, that Turkey was being held up as a model for the region, a modern country, democratic, Muslim, and the others should pay attention in the region. And I think in many ways, it got Ankara quite excited about their role in the region. I think up until that point, they were more concerned, and have been actually for decades, on just domestic issues. I mean, just keeping things going. And after the Cold War, of course, many of the Central Asian republics with ties to Turkey had called on Turkey for help, for assistance, and so forth. And then with the Arab Spring, we saw now the international community saying, Turkey, well, now go and help out in the Middle East. You've got a role to play there. And I think it seemed to be all going quite well. We saw Morsi come to power in Egypt. We saw the international community getting involved in Syria and urging the Syrian opposition to take up arms. And I remember being in Turkey in 2011 and visiting one of the major refugee camps at Kilis across the border, and meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials at that time. And everybody was quite clear that the camp would never reach capacity, about 30,000. It would be, this conflict in Syria would come to an end quickly, Bashar al-Assad would go, and any refugees that were in the camp would go home. And of course, now we fast forward and we find that there are 3.6 million or so Syrian refugees, temporary guests, if you like, in Turkey. And Turkey's done a very good job, I think, looking after them. It's quite daunting, actually, to think of the numbers. But it all backfired, of course, didn't it? I mean, Syria didn't go the way people thought. The Americans were dithering in Iraq. It created space for the Islamic State. At the same time, we're finding that this peace efforts with the PKK are beginning to fall apart. And we see incredible fighting in the Southeast in 2015 and 2016 between the government and members of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This is creating all sorts of problems for Turkey, and how to handle it. And so that's when I think things start to fall apart. And the tendency in Turkey, of course, is to drive towards this presidential system. because it's probably the way some people think that they can the only way they can handle everything that's going on is to have the reins on everything, and then you throw in an attempted military coup into the mix, and you end up with the Turkey that we see today, quite extended throughout the region, and with some significant economic issues, which have been, of course, greatly impacted by COVID, much like they have here. So, how do you get yourself out of this situation? But Balkan, there is a Turkish perspective on this, which I could also talk about, because, folks point the finger at Turkey for getting involved. But let's face it, a lot of the issues in the region were not caused by Turkey. It was NATO that took out the government in Libya in 2011. It was Western countries, of course, that tried to undermine the government in Syria. And of course, we can go back to 2003 with the invasion of Iraq as well. So many of the issues that are taking place in the Middle East were not caused by Turkey, but because Turkey has interests in the region, they had little choice but to get involved. Of course, you're going to get involved when you see millions of people fleeing to your country. So now I often say Turkey was left and still is left holding the bag. Nobody else is interested. They've all gone home. And so now it's up to Turkey to try to figure out what to do. And now if you're Turkish, if you're sitting in Ankara, it all makes sense to you because you're supporting the recognized government in Tripoli, the UN recognized government. You're supporting that government. Of course, it's in your interests, but it is the UN government. So there you go. And in Syria, you're still trying to repair a lot of the issues that have taken place because of the mess that was created. And in Iraq, you're worried about the presence of the PKK there because of the space that's been created by other Western interferences in the past. So it kind of all makes sense if you're Turkish, what you're doing. But then on the other hand, of course, the international community from a detached perspective is saying, well, what are you guys doing? You're occupying this, you're providing weapons to these people. There are some Syrian mercenaries in Libya. Where did they come from? And so it becomes quite negative how the international community views Turkey.
I think one of the reasons, and I think you highlighted quite nicely, is the fact that the Turkish government seemed to both into the praise a bit too much back in 2010s, and thus try to punch above its weight by trying to extend its influence in the region. And I think that was sort of one of the major reasons of failure for Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. The argument is that Turkey can reach out and change and reorder the region that would overlap with Turkish interests with the backing of the Western governments. And when things went south, the reversal in Turkish foreign policy came quite late. And I think Ahmet Davutoğlu is perhaps one of the biggest sort of responsible characters of that fiasco, in the sense that when things started going down south in late 2012, 2013, it took, particularly in Syria, it took another 3.5 years for Turkey to switch gears and give up the idea of regime change in Syria. While sort of the Western component of Obama administration, the sort of red lines going away by 2013. And I think that sort of overextension, trying to shape things beyond its own capabilities, that sort of ideological drive is also, I think, one of the primary reasons why Turkey failed to achieve its broader interests, and then end up being in this mess that is not in good terms with its traditional allies, but failed to also achieve its preferred foreign policy outcomes in the region, and then you end up with no friends really. From zero problems with neighbors to zero neighbors with problems. Foreign policy in one way, I guess.
Yeah. And in fact, we even compounded the issue too, because by sort of taking this hands-off approach to Syria and letting all of these red lines fall away, what happened? Well, the Russians came in. and filled the vacuum. And we can talk about Hezbollah and Iran, but let's focus on the Russians. So the Russians come in and fill the vacuum, which now puts another issue on Turkey's doorstep. Russia's already not happy about what happened in Libya. And this all leads to them grabbing Crimea, of course. And at the same time, because they are in Syria, we find, Turkey shooting down a Russian jet fighter in 2015. And then we see the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara by a Turkish policeman. This is the worst possible thing that you could ask for. And again, not to be overly sympathetic to Turkey, but this has been created by Western intervention, or lack of in this case. And then, so now Turkey's back against the wall. They first of all, they rely on Russia for a lot of their energy requirements, and not having much choice or ways to create friendly overtures with the Russians in the wake of all of this, I think they decide that it's a good idea to buy the S-400 missile system. And Turkey will say there are other reasons why they purchased that. The fact that the West wasn't willing to, sell them modern equipment with technology transfer and whatnot. But I think, again, very much like the Second World War, Balkan, where, Turkey had to, Ismet Inonu had to walk a very fine line between Russia, the Germans, of course, and the other allies, all pressuring Turkey to enter the war on their side. I mean, here we go again, this time with President Erdogan having to walk a very fine line as well between various players, and these are the actions that you see. Yeah.
If you look at a little bit further ahead, say 3, 4 years, 5 years down the road, is there a way out of this mess? In more broadly speaking, between Turkish-Western relations, or are we more likely to go on with the current tensions getting even deeper and deeper, and stuck in this quagmire?
Yeah, there are some big anniversaries coming up. If we look to the future, we're approaching February. It was 20 years ago or so when the Turkish economy it collapsed. We're approaching the 100th anniversary of Turkey. Elections, we have been watching what happened in the municipal elections and how things turned against the current government. There are a number of things at play. So when we do look to the future, as you say, we ask the question, what next? Well, I don't know. Is the economy going to survive? I have to say that Turkey is very economically resilient. They got through what happened 20 years ago. They got through what happened in 2008, 2009. So I would kind of be a little optimistic and say that they will get through this as well. But Syria is not going away. Libya is not going away. So these are going to continue to create concern for Turkey. The refugees, let's face it, the refugees are not going home. So now it's a question of how do you bring that community into the wider Turkish community? And I know work is already taking place on that, I think, behind the scenes, but it's not something that you talk about publicly in Turkey, I think. But let's face it, there isn't really much of an opposition in Turkey. At the national level, it's disjointed. There are so many little parties popping up right now. And I think, what I've written, though, is that you don't see that much difference between the political parties in Turkey in terms of policy. There's little room for maneuver. You don't have a party, not talking about the Kurdish HDP, but you don't have another party in Turkey saying, we should be talking to the PKK. What we're doing in Libya is wrong. What we're doing in Syria is wrong. You don't get that. You get parties saying, we should invest in the armed forces, and the other party saying, no, we should invest more in the armed forces. And so they're all of the same mindset, with very little differences between them, I think. And so politically, if people are thinking for some sort of massive course change in Turkey, I don't see that happening. Whether President Erdogan stays in power, whether somebody else from the party takes over, or in a completely different coalition would come about, I just don't see a policy change taking place. It's just going to be stick handling and managing crises after crises in that region. It's always been that way. Sadly, it's not changing, and Western actions in that region have not helped.
No, I totally agree with that in that sense. I might be a bit more pessimistic about the economic conditions going forward, but broadly, I very much agree with the fact that there are no real signs for fundamental changes, particularly when it comes to the foreign policy domain that could follow. There might be less adventurism perhaps with a different government. And a different focus on where the energies are. But some of the broader structural trends are there, and that would I think complicate things going forward.
Can I just add there, societally, I find that there are some little things to be concerned about. I'm concerned as a watcher of Turkey about the role of the nationalist MHP. We call them the Nationalist Party, but I think all parties in Turkey are nationalist. But the MHP, and they're part of that coalition with the AKP. We've seen some, worrying trends coming out of the MHP. And also the other societal issue is with the armed forces, because, just in the last few weeks, we saw a few hundred members of the armed forces arrested. This is, 4 years after the attempted coup. Alleged members of the Gulen network, they're being arrested. What that does, of course, in the armed forces is it creates great uncertainty and suspicion amongst the members of the military regarding their colleagues. Are their colleagues, if they talk to certain people and they end up, those folks get singled out as being Gulen members, well, the fact that they're friends with them or have a relationship, will that create an issue for them? I mean, I can't imagine what it's like in the armed forces, which at the same time is incredibly busy in the region. There are Turkish troops spread out all over the Middle East. So speaking as a former military person and knowing the Turkish military fairly well, it must be somewhat concerning. So there are so there's a couple of other issues at play in Turkey as well.
No, I think that's actually a fascinating subject. We probably need to make another episode on that, sort of both the transformation of Turkish armed forces, but also the use of armed forces in Turkish foreign policy, and how other like militias and proxies and special forces and private military companies, etc., play a role in Turkish foreign policy increasingly when it comes to Libya, in Syria, in the Caucasus, etc. I think that's a fascinating set of discussions. I would really like to have another sort of more deep dive on that, because that's really is a shift from the traditional role that Turkish armed forces played since the establishment of the republic. That, with the exception of Cyprus, expeditionary force structure outside NATO operations was not something Turkish armed forces was very much involved in, or the use of proxies and so on and so forth. So I think that's a fascinating and an emerging area that we need to pay attention to. But I definitely would like to have a separate, complete episode for that. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming here today and joining us and sharing your opinions and your view with us and with the audience. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. It's great.